Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome all of you to my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for this episode, this will be movies 238 through 240. Okay, guys, so summer is officially here, and it's 200 degrees outside. Yeah, I had to shave my beard a little bit to a goatee because I was burning the fuck up, and so yeah, summer's officially here. And just to kick off the summer this week, I am talking about a whole bunch of movies that all share this common theme that is near and dear to my heart, and that is summer camp. So long before I ever attended a summer camp as a kid, I just loved the concept of it through movies. Although my introduction to summer camp was through the Friday the 13th movies, and you would think those might be enough to to scare me away or to scare a kid away from going to summer camp. There were several other movies from my childhood with a more lighthearted tone that would draw me into that kind of setting. Um, I didn't attend a summer camp until I was a teenager in high school, but it was one of the best weeks of my life. And the camp was called Rockbridge Young Life Camp, and it was located in the Shenandoah Valley, just like 15 miles west of Lexington, Virginia. Kids from all over the country came to attend this camp where every day had a different theme and different games and activities. Um, if you've ever seen the Disney movie Heavyweights, which is one of the movies that I'm going to be covering this week, that movie came out in the '90s, and the camp was every bit like that. The blob on the lake and all. There was like zip lines, all that stuff. So, like I said, it was just like every bit like the camp in the movie. At least before the part of the movie when Ben Stiller's character Tony Perkins takes over the camp. Um, and he takes away the blob and all the cool stuff at the camp. He takes away, but all that cool stuff that you see in the beginning of that movie that was just like what we had at Rockbridge. And I made a lot of friends from all over the country that week. And just a lot of great memories that I'll never forget. So yeah, you can say that my love has developed over the years for summer camp films, and and a lot of it has to do with my own personal experience. Um, but as for today's episode and the movies I'm going to be talking about today, I can gladly say that my experience at Rockbridge was far different from the camps um, in these movies. So today I'm going to be talking about the Sleepaway Camp movies from the '80s, and these three movies are some of my absolute favorite movies in the whole slasher genre. For me, they're right up there with the Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Halloween franchises. So, let's go ahead and kick off summer camp week in the best way possible by talking about the 1983 classic and the original film in this awesome franchise, Sleepaway Camp. So, what is Sleepaway Camp? So, on the surface, it's this '80s, slasher flick, that was released firmly in the wake of Friday the 13th's massive success. And it follows that established formula, a summer camp setting, a mysterious killer, a body count, and a whole group of teenagers, and young adults that are trying to survive. But to leave it at that would be doing a tremendous disservice to what I think is one of the most unique, unsettling, and just frankly brave horror films of its era. So this movie is set primarily at uh, the fictional camp, of course, Camp Arawak. And the film introduces us to, this classic summer camp scene, rustic cabins, a lake, mess halls, a mix of these eager, awkward, and obnoxious campers and counselors. And our central figures here are shy, withdrawn Angela Baker, who's played by the incredible Felissa Rose in her debut role. And then you have her protective, slightly older cousin, Ricky, who's played by Jonathan Tiersten. And then, of course, I can't go without mentioning their very eccentric, possibly unstable Aunt Martha. Um, and the actress's name that played Aunt Martha escapes me at this moment, but a lot of you Sleepaway Camp fans out there will know that good and well. But anyway, the setup for Angela's character is key for this movie. We're told through this kind of brief, jarring flashback at the beginning that Angela and her brother Peter and their father John were all involved in this tragic boating accident years ago. And this, just results in the deaths of the father and Peter, her brother. So Angela is the sole survivor, from her family unit, left severely traumatized and just mostly nonverbal. So Aunt Martha takes her in, raising her in almost like isolation. Um, and the film properly begins with Angela's kind of reluctant return to society via going to Camp Arawak with her cousin Ricky. And from the moment that she arrives, Angela is seen as an outsider. Her shyness is perceived as this kind of strange, the strangeness. Her silence is kind of misinterpreted, and she quickly becomes this target, of this relentless, and cruel bullying from like fellow campers, like the venomous Judy and that sleazy duo of Kenny and Mike. Um, and the counselors too, are often kind of oblivious and ineffective or complicit, in the all these microaggressions and this outright torment that Angela's facing. And so as summer progresses and the pressures on Angela start to mount, all these strange accidents begin to happen, including this accident with the pedophile cook Artie, who earlier in the film tries to attempt to molest Angela. But he meets this kind of grisly end, involving boiling water pouring all over him, and then there's these bullies at the camp, that are targeted with all these different brutal and elaborate accidents. It quickly kind of becomes clear that someone is just systematically killing all these people who wrong or even kind of mildly inconvenience Angela. So what distinguishes Sleepaway Camp here isn't just the kills, which are memorable, um, but sometimes due to their gore, sometimes due to their the sheer oddity and just the low budget effects and everything. But just what distinguishes it even more than that is the atmosphere. The film perfectly captured that awkward, that the awkwardness of all the campers, especially Angela, and just the petty cruelties um and just that slightly kind of unwashed vibe of a real summer camp. The dialogue often kind of feels authentic to these teenagers talking awkwardly with one another. The adults seem flawed and kind of fallible, um, and just this grounding in kind of a mundane reality kind of makes the horror feel even more jarring in the film. Um, and the film builds tension not just through like the stalking and the killing, but just kind of through that psychological torment of Angela, and that kind of protective fury from her cousin Ricky, and just that escalating paranoia, among the camp staff and the campers. It's a classic whodunit structure, kind of wrapped in a slasher skin with this limited pool of suspects. Could it be a deranged counselor? Could it be a Ron Camper? Someone from the past. And then there's the ending of this film. I mean, and if you are familiar with this film, you know that the ending is crazy and out of nowhere. Like, and I'll discuss its impact later, but suffice to say, Sleepaway Camp is defined by its final minutes more than almost any other horror film. Um, it's a revelation so shocking, so unexpected, and just so utterly bizarre that it instantly, cemented the film's place in horror history and just launched 1,000, confused, terrified discussions about this film. It's the kind of ending that really redefines everything you've just watched and kind of forces you to reevaluate characters and motives and just the entire narrative. It's brilliant precisely because it's so audacious and earned through the film's subtle and sometimes not so subtle character work and the psychological undertones. And for a fan, watching Sleepaway Camp is a journey. It's appreciating that low budget ingenuity, the performances that range from genuinely affecting, like from Felissa Rose, to these hilarious over the top unique fashion choices. Um, the really oddly catchy incidental music, and just that kind of palpable sense of discomfort, that the film expertly cultivates. Um, it's a film that really gets under your skin, not necessarily through like relentless jump scares, although there's a few, but more so through its portrayal of human cruelty, its kind of disturbing psychological core, and of course, that unforgettable conclusion of the film. So Robert uh, Hiltzik was the director of this, and unlike many directors who helmed 80s slashers, um, he Sleepaway Camp was for many years his only film. He wrote and directed it as his directorial debut um, after graduating film school, and this is crucial, I think, to understanding the film's kind of unique quality. It doesn't feel like a product that was churned out by this studio, following a trend. Um, it feels like the kind of intensely personal vision of this single filmmaker. Um, and like I said, he wasn't known for anything else before Sleepaway Camp, and for decades he wasn't known for anything else after it either. Um, this kind of lack of a lengthy filmography only kind of adds to the mystique of the original film, in my opinion. Um, so where did this disturbing, insightful, and just utterly bonkers story come from? And it wasn't until 2008, which was 25 years later after the original film, that he returned to the franchise where he created Return to Sleepaway Camp. And he brought back Felissa Rose and Jonathan Tiersten for that. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about today because I don't really care for that film. Whenever I'm rewatching the Sleepaway Camp movies, I always leave that one out because I just don't think it's very good. I don't mean any disrespect to Robert Hiltzik, but I mean, if I were him, if I could redo things, I wouldn't have touched that with a 10-foot pole because it just did not. I mean, it has its fans for sure. It tried to recapture the original's tone, um, but it just I don't know. I always felt like it fell flat. Of what it was trying to accomplish, but yeah, I mean, I do commend him for at least trying to come back into the franchise. And I think after he did that one, I think he was done after that. But his direction in the original Sleepaway Camp is just surprisingly effective for a debut, though. He captures that kind of mundane reality of the camp very convincingly. He knows when to linger on Angela's, quiet observation and when to kind of unleash these sudden, brutal acts of violence. Um, and he also, manages to kind of, elicit genuinely memorable performances from all of these young kids, these young actors. And critically, he builds towards that ending with deliberate pacing, and certain clues and red herrings that become, kind of horrifyingly clear in retrospect. But Hiltzik's unique perspective, free from the constraints of experiences of a seasoned Hollywood director, are arguably allowed him to craft something so unconventional and unsettling. And Sleepaway Camp is, I think, his legacy, a testament to a singular idea that's executed with kind of a raw, unpolished passion. So, yeah, and to talk about further the legacy of this film, um, it's fascinating because Sleepaway Camp, it wasn't um the 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 love for it was not immediate or anything in mainstream. So really upon its initial release, it kind of received mixed to negative reviews from a lot of mainstream critics. And if you've watched my show before, you know how I feel about mainstream critics. Um, but anyway, they often dismissed it as just another, you know, ordinary slasher with questionable acting and low production values or whatever. It wasn't a box office, smash or anything like Friday the 13th. However, like many cult classics, and I've stated this many times here on the show, like many cult classics, it found its audience on home video. So, the rise of the VCR in the 1980s was just the perfect breeding ground for Sleepaway Camp. You know, um, just word of mouth spread, primarily focused on that ending of the film. Friends, from what I understand, would dare each other to watch it. Just promising this kind of unforgettable, conclusion. Just that the whole buzz surrounding it was, it was building slowly, but surely, it built that film's reputation that it is today. Um, and its impact can be dissected in several key areas as well. Like, so first of all, that iconic ending. I mean, this is, I think, undoubtedly the primary driver of its legacy. Just that final reveal is one of the most shocking, and audacious and just debated conclusions in horror history. It's not just a twist; it's a complete subversion of slasher themes and these kind of society expectations, and just particularly concerning like gender identity. Um, and while modern interpretations explore this aspect with more nuance and sensitivity, regarding trans themes, um, within that context in 1983, it was just purely presented for shock value. It left audiences stunned, confused, and just often disturbed. No one who sees the ending of Sleepaway Camp forgets it at all. I mean, it became a benchmark, I think, for shocking horror finales, and it's still discussed, and analyzed and argued about to this day. Um, but when it comes to cult status and the whole endurance of the film, Sleepaway Camp didn't become a mainstream hit, but it became a beloved cult classic, like so many other great horror films out there that was underappreciated at the time of their release. Fans embraced its quirks, its low budget aesthetic, um, its sometimes awkward performances, and especially its unique identity within the crowded slasher market. Because there was a ton of slasher movies just coming out around this time in the 80s, and it proved that a film didn't need massive box office success or any kind of critical acclaim to really find this devoted, enduring audience that it has to this day. Its cult status has only grown and grown over time, fueled by nostalgia, and just rediscovery through physical media, and streaming, and just the continuous fascination with its ending. Um, and there was a lot of influence that this film would build going forward with the horror genre, the slasher subgenre. And while it might not have directly influenced specific plot points as much as Halloween or Friday the 13th, um, Sleepaway Camps had this willingness to push boundaries and just deliver this truly shocking, um, psychologically complex reveals, uh, and that certainly contributed to the slasher genre's just evolution. I think it showed that these films could explore these darker, more unsettling things beneath the surface, and just uh, which was the all the gore and the chase sequences and all that, and its focus on childhood trauma as kind of a catalyst for the horror of it all was very unique, I think, for that time. um, and the original film, it helped spawn this franchise, although one that kind of changed tones drastically. And we'll talk about those here coming up. Sleepaway Camp 2, Unhappy Campers, and Sleepaway Camp 3, Teenage Wasteland. They brought back Angela as this camp counselor, with a different actress, Pamela Springsteen, who and the that character of Angela is now this overtly cheerful, wisecracking serial killer. While it's fun in their own right and beloved by many fans, they lean more heavily into black comedy and meta commentary, and they really abandon that unsettling atmosphere and psychological depth, of the original. And I'm not saying that like in a bad way, because once I start talking about those films, you'll understand like how much that I love those films just as much as I do the original. Um, and just but with the fan community though for the original Sleepaway Camp, yeah, I think it has one of the most dedicated fan bases. Um, so like online communities dissect every scene, every potential clue. The cast, particularly Felissa Rose, she frequently attends horror conventions where she and the rest of the cast are rightly celebrated. And Felissa Rose is one of the sweetest human beings you'll ever meet in your life. Um, if you've never been to a convention, or if you do go to conventions and you just never met Felissa Rose, I'm telling you, take that opportunity, especially if you're a fan of the original Sleepaway Camp, if you're just a fan of her, in general of her other roles. But she's one of the coolest, kindest people that you ever meet, at celebrity or non-celebrity. She's just super cool, and I love seeing her at every show she attends that I'm able to attend as well. Um, but getting back to the film, and the whole like fan community thing, um, the ending of the movie, like I said, multiple times now, continues to be a subject of just that, fan analysis, exploring that themes of like identity and trauma and social pressure and gender, and just a lot of different topics to talk about when it comes to the community surrounding Sleepaway Camp. But in essence, I guess Sleepaway Camp its legacy is really built on its that defiance of expectation. It took a popular formula, and infused it with a genuine sense of psychological disturbance, depicting bullying with this kind of uncomfortable realism. And it just delivered a conclusion that was so daring, for its time, and it's still discussed decades later. It's a film that proves low budget horror can be truly impactful and memorable and just capable of kind of sparking this enduring conversation. Um, and from a fan's perspective, so why do I love Sleepaway Camp? Well, basically, it's all the above, everything that I've talked about and more. It's just that the feeling of watching something genuinely unique. Even within the crowded '80s slasher landscape from that time. It's that raw, almost amateur quality that really makes it feel more authentic than these slicker productions that are out there. It's Felissa Rose's, astonishing performance. The way she conveys so much with just her eyes and her body language, before the climax. It's mesmerizing. And then also I love Jonathan Tiersten as Ricky, and just that protective performance that he gives, always defending Angela, just the only person or one of the only people that comes across as truly caring for Angela amidst all this cruelty that she goes through. Um, and and it's the bizarre, uncomfortable dialogue and character interactions that feel less like scripted movie scenes and more like eavesdropping on these awkward teenagers. And I love that. I mean, because that's why I feel like it feels so authentic to me. And then if you look at the kills in this movie, each of these kills really leave a a distinct, unsettling impression on you all throughout the film. It's the way that the film contrasts that the innocence of these summer camp activities with this escalating horror. Um, but more than anything, when it comes to why I love this movie, it's the ending. I mean, even after multiple viewings, knowing it, I know it's coming. That final shot, that final reveal, that final horrifying sound, it never loses its power or its impact. It's just like a lightning strike of pure unadulterated horror. It challenges you, it disturbs you, it forces you to just reconsider everything that you thought you knew about this film and its characters. To me, it's a perfect, devastating capstone to all the preceding events in the film. So overall, Sleepaway Camp it isn't technically a perfect film. Some of the acting is wooden, some pacing is slow. There's budget limitations, um, but these aren't flaws to a fan. They're part of its charm. They make the moments that do work, the moments of that genuine dread and shock, just land with an even greater impact. It feels like stepping into a slightly off kilter reality where summer camp purity is just constantly threatened by this human ugliness and just deep seated trauma. It's a film that I definitely revisit often. Um, Sometimes I've watched it with uh, fellow fans like or friends, family. Just kind of revealing its kind of unique glory. Um, and sometimes I'll watch it alone though too, just to kind of appreciate it more for its kind of unsettling atmosphere. It's it's a film that I think rewards rewatching it as you kind of pick up on subtle clues and performances that that hint at that devastating truth. It's a cornerstone of cult horror, I feel, and just a vital piece of '80s cinema history that dared to be different. It dared to be uncomfortable and just deliver this ending that would be talked about forever. So I mean, if you're a horror fan, I hope I didn't give too much this movie away if you've never seen it. But if you're a horror fan who appreciates films outside the mainstream, um, that films that take risks, films with these kind of unforgettable moments, and just films that leave you thinking long after the credits roll, then Sleepaway Camp is a must watch. You need to just go in knowing that it's not polished, um, but know that it has a heart to it, a very dark, twisted heart, but and just a mind, in all of its own. And just be prepared for that ending. If you've never seen it, you've been warned, and trust me, it's worth the trip though. But to wrap up my thoughts on the original Sleepaway Camp, I think it is a prime example of how a low budget, initially overlooked film can achieve this lasting, cultural significance just through sheer originality and just a willingness to shock people. Robert Hiltzik, he had this singular vision, this of unsettling atmosphere, and just that strong, central performances from these kids and and adults alike too, and just above all, that legendary ending. Um, you know, c- all that combines to kind of create this horror film that really stands apart. It's a cherished cult classic, for a reason. A bizarre, uncomfortable, and ultimately brilliant, piece of horror cinema that just continues to fascinate and disturb audiences, decades after its release. Um, it's a masterpiece of the unexpected, and for fans like me, it's an enduring source of horror, fascination and just affectionate admiration. So long live Camp Arawak and long live Angela Baker's unforgettable legacy with the original Sleepaway Camp. And I see we got some comments in the chat. Let's see what's going on here. So we got Grande's Graveyard, my buddy John Grande. So you say great points on the director. He really did do a good job considering this was his debut. The ending is definitely unforgettable. Yeah, man. Like it's so wild. Like this was his absolute, first film that he'd ever done, straight out of film school. Um, and he didn't do anything else until 2008 when he did Return to Sleepaway Camp. And I don't think he did anything after that either. But like this, if I were, like I said earlier, in the stream, I was saying that I would have just left it alone, man. I wouldn't even done Return to Sleepaway Camp because to me, I mean, I know, like I said, there's fans of that movie, but like that's just one that I did not like. I could not, I've watched it once and that was it. It was not one I wanted to rewatch at any point in my life. But like I do respect, where he was coming from with that one. He was trying to just return to those original roots of the first film. Um, I don't know if he thought that he was going to make a film as good or as loved as the original. Um, but I mean, that doesn't take away at all. Regardless, it doesn't take away from how good and how legendary the original Sleepaway Camp is. Um, Said, man, it's funny. I once went to a screening with all three of the Sleepaway Camp movies. Felissa was there, super kind, but over half the people left after the OGS. Wow, that's crazy, man. Like, I love Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3 um, just as much as I do the original for different reasons. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit once I get into Sleepaway Camp 2. Um, but yeah, that's wild that people left after the original. Like, I don't know. This is different, different strokes for different folks, I guess. I love the sequels. I love Pamela Springsteen. I thought she did an amazing job as Angela. It's a much different portrayal of Angela, and we'll get into that too, than what Felissa Rose portrayed Angela as. But yeah, those are super fun, man. You said maybe the tone will change from part one to part two and three is too much for people, but man, I love those sequels a lot. Yeah, yeah, same here, man. Same here. met him. He was an interesting guy. He became a lawyer after making. Oh, you're talking about Robert Hiltzik. So he. I didn't know that. That's interesting. So he became a lawyer after making the movie and didn't realize the cult following for over a decade. Wow. So he was oblivious to for the love for this. I mean, I wonder, has he ever done a convention or anything? I wonder, is he? Uh, Maybe not. I mean, he's probably too busy being a lawyer or whatever. But he said he also admitted return didn't turn. Yeah, it didn't, man. Like I just, not for me at least. It just, I don't know. But for anybody watching this is interested, check out my friend John Grande's channel, Grande's Graveyard, where I'll actually be on there with him for a horror roundtable next month on the 24th, I think it is, July the 24th. So definitely check out his channel. He's got some really cool stuff on there. He talks about movies and all that too. So if you definitely, check out him, subscribe to him, and yeah. So let's go ahead and move on now. Up next, we have this movie. Oh man, so this is, like I said, this is definitely the whole franchise itself is just one of my favorite slasher. Some of my favorite slasher movies in the whole subgenre. Um, and for those of us who were, kind of irrevocably charged by the chilling, unforgettable ending of the original 1983 classic, um, the idea of a sequel might have initially felt unnecessary. I mean, how could anything follow that? How could anything follow the original film? How could you possibly recapture that level, of psychological horror, that slow burn dread, just culminating in that final iconic, deeply disturbing image of the original? Well, let me tell you, when Sleepaway Camp 2 Unhappy Campers was released in 1988, it didn't just follow the original. It took the core concept, the summer camp, teenagers, mysterious killer, and just exploded it into something entirely new, something so amazing, so gory, so hilariously different. And just, I'm a huge fan of the first film, but I'm a huge fan of Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But Sleepaway Camp 2 is not just a good sequel, it's an essential one. It's one that, if you watch the original, you have to watch the sequels. And Sleepaway Camp 2 is just a perfect companion piece. I think that, it solidifies, Angela Baker's place in horror history, although for wildly different reasons than her debut in the original film. Um, so Sleepaway Camp 2 from 1988, it's set several years after the Camp Arawak massacre. And this movie, brings us to Camp Rolling Hills. And it's your typical late 80s movie summer camp, filled with these horny counselors, rebellious teenagers, cliques, just plenty of opportunities, for mischief. But this camp has a dark secret, or rather a dark counselor. So Angela Baker is back, but she's not the shy, withdrawn, traumatized victim that we knew. Oh no, this Angela is confident. She's outgoing, chatty, and moonlighting as this counselor named Angela Johnson. So she's seemingly adjusted, but you scratch that surface and you find that same twisted moral code, that same violent, impulses that she has, is now amplified and, and delivered with a kind of ch- chillingly cheerful demeanor. Um, so the genius of Sleepaway Camp 2 is that it immediately reveals Angela's identity, and her role as the killer. There's no mystery here, no slow reveal like the first film. Instead, the tension comes from watching Angela interact with the unsuspecting campers and staff, knowing who she is and what she's capable of. Um, And boy, is she capable of what she does in this film. I mean, Angela has developed a very specific set of rules for her campers. No drugs, no premarital sex, no swearing, no disrespect, no general bad behavior, as as defined by her kind of warped sense of morality. Um, and those who break the rules face this kind of brutal and often darkly comedic punishment. Um, the film leans heavily into the uh, slasher themes of the era, but with this kind of undeniable wink. The kills are numerous, creative, and delivered with this kind of gleeful practicality from Angela. We see campers meet their end via a drill, drowning in a toilet, being turned into a human campfire, cut up by a chainsaw, or even a Freddy Krueger glove. Yes, a Freddy Krueger glove. That's so. There's one scene in the film, and it's just basically a tribute to the slasher icons, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Leatherface, and I love it. It's so cool. And if you remember the VHS cover, it was supposed to be. It shows a girl. I guess it's supposed to be Angela, but it's not Pamela Springsteen on the cover. And she's got like a backpack, and it's got like the Jason mask and the Freddy glove hanging out of it. So yeah, they tie that that cover. Which, if you remember, a lot of VHS cover arts, especially ones from the '80s, they had nothing to do what was going on in the actual film, but they did take that cover art from Sleepaway Camp 2 VHS and kind of tie that into a scene in the film. Um, and it's one of my favorite scenes in the entire film. But within this movie, the gore is just plentiful, but it's often showcased with Angela's almost chipper delivery of these lines and these scenes. She'll scold a victim for their poor choices while actively disposing of them by killing them. So crucially, Sleepaway Camp 2 is a black comedy first, slasher second. It knows exactly what it is. It doesn't try to be, the atmospheric, disturbing psychological horror of the original. It embraces that absurdity. Angela makes these kind of meta references to, like I said, the other horror icons like Freddy and Jason and Leatherface. So in that sense, she's a horror fan herself. Um, or at least it seems that way. But she's a fan in the sense where her fandom manifests in these deadly ways. Um, but the film captures that whole late '80s VHS horror vibe perfectly. It's cheap, it's gory, it's got a synth heavy score, and it's just undeniably fun. And the heart of that fun lies squarely with Pamela Springsteen's iconic portrayal of Angela. Um, she is just magnetic on screen. She's just terrifying and just hilarious all at once. She has actual dialogue. Compared to Felissa Rose's character in the original. She interacts, she schemes and plots. Not just silently follows. Her performance is this kind of revelation. Transforming Angela from a tragic figure into this bona fide, charismatic horror villain. And you love to hate her, but honestly, you just kind of love her. I mean, if you're me, because she's having such a blast with this everything that she's doing in the film. I mean, and Pamela Springsteen has always been, from the moment I started attending conventions back in 2009, she's always on my guest request list, like at the top of that list. Um, but she has never done a convention. I've talked to several promoters and agents, and they've all tried to get her. They've all tried to pull her in for a convention. But I mean, I want to say, never say never. But I don't know. It's not looking good that she's ever going to do a convention, but man, if she does, if it's anywhere within like driving distance, a fair amount of driving distance for me, I would definitely attend, um, to meet her and just let her know how much I love her performance as Angela. Um, But I think she's got like her own photography business now, and and for anybody wondering, yeah, she is the sister to Bruce Springsteen. But yeah, I think she has her own photography business. She's doing well with that, and I just think that she just kind of lost interest in the whole horror genre. She's not worried about you know making any money off from it or anything. But I feel like she did. She could make some good money because there's a ton of fans out there, Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3, and just love her performance as Angela. But let's go ahead and talk about the director a little bit. So, the director behind this glorious shift in tone is Michael A. Simpson. Um, and Simpson isn't a household name like Craven or Carpenter, but he became, I think, pretty much well known and linked with the Sleepaway Camp franchise. In the late '80s more than anything. He stepped in to direct not only Sleepaway Camp 2 Unhappy Campers, but he would also direct its immediate sequel, Sleepaway Camp 3 Teenage Wasteland. Um, but he is the director who successfully resurrected the series and more importantly reinvented it. He understood that you couldn't replicate the original's shock ending and its structure or its that psychological horror vibe without feeling like a pale imitation. Instead he embraced the camp setting, the gore, the humor, and crucially, gave the audience the killer, that they now want to see in action. He took Angela, who was defined by her silence and victimhood in the first film's climax, and and gave her a voice, a personality, and a purpose. So his direction really facilitated Pamela Springsteen's performance. Allowing her to kind of just chew the scenery and and become that memorable figure that she is known as today. Um, and while he may not have a lengthy list of famous films, Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3, I think, are his lasting legacy. And that's another guy that I would love to meet. I would love to meet at a convention. Um, just because, with these films, he really showcased this ability to pivot a franchise's tone successfully and just deliver exactly what a segment of the horror audience wanted. It was just creative kills and just a fun, charismatic villain. Um, and John said, "Yeah, Pamela Springsteen, she is electric in this role. The energy she has is unmatched. I love the psychology too. She just wants everyone to be as moral as her. That's impossible with teenagers." And I say this a lot, but I feel like she was made for that role. Like like for the idea of changing up the personality so drastically with Angela. Um, Pamela Springsteen just pulls that role off perfectly. And to me, she is one of the main appeals of the sequels. She is one of the biggest reasons why I love the sequels so much. And, because, for a lot of franchises, when films in a franchise kind of drastically change tone or something like that, there's a lot of criticism amongst fans too, for those those changes. But with this franchise, with the Sleepaway Camp films, this is one of the very few franchises where there's such a insane tonal change, that I've not really heard anyone complain about them or have any kind of harsh criticism towards that change. And I think that's what makes these films, so amazing, so legendary is that there's least amount of criticism regarding them. You know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say? Like it's just but that's why I love them so much. It's why they're so interesting to me. Um Simpson made solid movies. Funland. Oh, did he do Funland? Man, I haven't seen that movie in so long. I have that on VHS, but it's been years. So I had no idea that he actually did that. So that's one I definitely need to go back and revisit as well. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would love to meet him at a show too. Like I don't know if he's ever done one, but that would be really cool. I would love to talk to him about these films for sure. Um, But to talk about the legacy of Sleepaway Camp 2, particularly when viewed, alongside Sleepaway Camp 3, it's significant for fans of the series, and low budget 80s horror. Firstly, it solidified Sleepaway Camp, you know, as a franchise, not just a one hit wonder. While the original is legendary for its ending, it could have easily remained a standalone cult film, but part two proved that there was more story to tell. Even if that story was wildly different in execution, by uh, making Angela, the central active villain, the sequels gave the series um, a clear identity, beyond just that shocking twist. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it created this iconic, horror villain in the form of this chatty, murderous Angela Baker. Pamela Springsteen's portrayal in part two and part three is just what many fans now think of when they think of Angela. She's not just a kid from the end of the first movie. She's this counselor who kills you, for wearing too much makeup or talking back, or she stands out uh she stands out among mostly the silent mass male slashers of the era. Her dialogue, her twisted reasoning, her practical kills. She's this kind of fully formed this fully formed character that and just the sequels gave her that stage that she needed. She is now firmly, I think, part of that whole horror villain lexicon, largely thanks to Unhappy Campers. Um, I it's hard for me to say, like, if the sequels had never existed, if the original film was just the only film that was put out there, would the Angela character be as beloved as she is? I mean, I think so. I think that she would still be beloved, but like I just feel like with the addition of the sequels and that so wildly different portrayal of Angela with Pamela Springsteen, um, it really developed people's love and interest in that character, and I definitely put her up there in that whole lexicon, of horror villains like Freddy Krueger and Jason and Leatherface and Michael Myers and Chucky and all these iconic horror villains that have been throughout history. Um, well, at least in the slasher genre. And but thirdly, it successfully navigated, a that tonal shift that I've been talking about. It's a very radical tonal shift, and this is harder than it sounds. So many horror sequels try to replicate, the original and fail. Sleepaway Camp 2 didn't try to be the original psychological horror. It leaped head first into black comedy and gore, and it worked for its target audience. It showed that a franchise could pivot genres and still find a loyal fan base. Just this embrace of that kind of meta humor, creative gore, and just a charismatic villain became this hallmark of the direct to video horror scene in the late 80s and the early 90s. Um, and also it just sorry, I didn't realize I still had that up on the screen. But fourthly, it became a beloved cult classic, in its own right. While the original might be more critically discussed for its ending, Sleepaway Camp 2 is often cited, by fans as one of their favorite entries or their main favorite entry. This, if I had to choose out of the first three Sleepaway Camp films, Sleepaway Camp 2 may be my favorite out of those 3 films. Um, and it's because it's just the sheer entertainment value. It's the fun one out of the bunch. It's the one with the memorable lines and the crazy kills, and it's incredibly rewatchable. Precisely because it's not trying to be serious. Its availability on home video, VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, over there, and soon to be, they're coming out with. I know they're putting out Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3 on 4K here soon from Scream Factory. But just it's really cemented its status, and introduced it to new generations of horror fans, looking for that kind of specific brand of 80s, slasher absurdity. Um, but finally, it influenced that perception of direct to video horror. So Sleepaway Camp 2 was released straight to video, which was common for horror sequels in this period. Its quality and popularity showed that direct to video didn't automatically mean poor quality. It could mean creative freedom to be gorier and funnier and more experimental than just a theatrical release might allow. But I guess in conclusion, because of Sleepaway Camp 2, and I'm a fan who really cherishes the just that whole disturbing power of the original Sleepaway Camp. I can remember that when I approached Sleepaway Camp 2, um, with a bit of worry that it was going to be disappointing. But what I found was not a disappointment, but this delightful surprise. It's a different beast entirely. Just trading psychological terror for this kind of pitch black comedy and inventive gore. And Michael Michael Simpson's direction really paved the way, for Pamela Springsteen to etch um, Angela Baker into that hall of legends of horror villainy, with just a performance that is both terrifying and incredibly fun. And just the film's legacy here is secure. It's the sequel that gave that series life beyond its initial shock. Created this unforgettable character and just stands, uh, um, just really just stands as a prime example of how great 80s direct to video horror could be. Direct to video horror could be when it wasn't afraid to be just absolutely, wonderfully bonkers. It's a required viewing, I think, for any fan of the original who's just ready to see Angela unleashed. Um, yeah, so like definitely check out Sleepaway Camp 2 if you are, new to the Sleepaway Camp franchise. I mean, I say check out all 3 of these at the same time. Like, you can't watch the original and then not check out these sequels. So, yeah, I love Sleepaway Camp 2, but now we move on to the last film we'll be talking about for today. Um, and, there's a specific joy, I think, that comes with diving back into that kind of peculiar, twisted world of Angela Baker. And while the original 1983 film, is known for its genuinely shocking, disturbing ending, Sleepaway Camp 3, just like we said about Sleepaway Camp 2, is where that series truly embraces its inner chaotic, dark comedic heart. Excuse me. So, and let me tell you, for a fan like me, that that embrace is just pure unadulterated camp chaos, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So let's talk about Sleepaway Camp 3 Teenage Wasteland from 1989. So, following hot on the heels of the second film, this movie just came out like a year later. Part 3 finds our beloved psychotic heroine Angela Baker once again escaping psychiatric care and naturally, deciding the best place to hide out and indulge her murderous urges is another summer camp. But this isn't just any camp. This is Camp New Horizons. A supposedly progressive initiative, bringing together privileged teens and underprivileged urban youth under the banner of harmony and understanding. So Angela, under the hilarious, alias Maria, infiltrates this kind of social experiment, posing as one of the troubled city kids. Um, so the premise itself is ripe for satire, or at least exploitation, film commentary on social dynamics. But the film quickly, goes um, it quickly jettisons, I guess, any deep messaging in favor of what it truly excels at, and that's creative kills and delivering Pamela Springsteen's widely entertaining portrayal of Angela. The campers and the counselors are, of course, a collection of kind of eye rolling, stereotypes and caricatures. The snobs, the rebels, the overly sensitive, the jocks, the perpetually horny, the well-meaning but clueless counselors, and the arrogant director. They are essentially lambs to the slaughter. Existing primarily to be dispatched by Angela in increasingly imaginative and darkly humorous ways. Um, and what makes Sleepaway Camp 3 work so well for fans, despite its obvious low budget and sometimes questionable acting from the supporting cast, um, is its just enthusiastic, commitment to its own absurdity. It doesn't try to be scary in the traditional sense like the original. It fully leans into that comedic potential of its premise and the antagonist. Um, the the kills are less about suspense and just more about punchlines. And so Angela, dispatches her victims with this gleeful sadism and just often kind of a quip or a sarcastic remark that perfectly encapsulates her character's kind of deranged logic. Um, Whether it's a literal crushing under a garbage truck, or just creatively applied lawnmower. Each death is just designed for that maximum shock value and dark humor. And Pamela Springsteen is once again just the absolute linchpin of the film. So in Sleepaway Camp 3, she perfects that blend of deceptive sweetness and that awkward social maneuvering and sudden just chilling bursts of rage and violence, and her Angela is just a master manipulator. That charismatic enough to blend in while secretly judging everyone around her based on her own kind of twisted moral code. She delivers her lines with just a perfect deadpan or a chillingly innocent smile. She is the show, and the film wisely gives her ample screen time to shine in all this, um, to just to shine in all that kind of deranged glory. Um, but the film's aesthetic is just pure late '80s B movie. Slightly grainy. That functional cinematography, synthesized score, um, and just the fashion that perfectly dates it. While some might see this as a negative, again, for fans of this era, it's part of the charm, guys. It feels authentic to its time and the budget, and it really adds to its kind of unpretentious, schlocky appeal. Um, the camp setting, though less idyllic than the first film's Arawak or the second film's Rolling Hills, it still provides a fun isolated backdrop for Angela and her rampage. Um, just the contrast between the whole diverse group of teens, and that whole rustic setting provides some unintentional or maybe intentional, I'm not sure, comedy as they clash both culturally, and fatally. Um, but finally, let's get into the legacy and the impact of this. So the original Sleepaway Camp, holds a secure place, I think, in horror history, primarily because of that jaw dropping ending, which is still discussed. debated and imitated today. It single handedly elevated a just a relatively standard slasher film into a cult phenomenon. Um, However, the legacy of the Sleepaway Camp franchise doesn't end there, and the sequels are just a vital piece of that puzzle. Excuse me. So, just that enduring legacy is arguably centered around Angela Baker. And while the original introduced her and the twist, the sequels 2 and 3 especially, thanks to Michael Simpson and Pamela Springsteen, solidified her as one of the most unique and memorable slasher villains, and of that era. I mean, like I said before, she talks, she schemes, she laughs, she judges, she's genuinely weird. Uh, this whole character evolution is heavily showcased in the sequels. It contributes massively to the series' cult status. Uh, and just fans return not just for that nostalgia, but for more Angela. And after Sleepaway Camp 3, like I wanted more. Like I wish there could have been more Sleepaway Camp, sequels with Pamela Springsteen returning, because knowing how this one ends, like it kind of sets that up. It kind of sets it up that there's going to be more. But unfortunately, we never got any more Sleepaway Camp films, with Pamela Springsteen at least, and that's so unfortunate because it's one of those things that what could have been. But Sleepaway Camp 3's specific impact, I think, lies in cementing the sequel formula, which is more kills, more comedy, more Angela being Angela. It proved there was this appetite for this shift and just helped define the series' identity beyond just that twist ending. It's part of the package that makes Sleepaway Camp different from Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. While Freddy Krueger became a comedian, he was still this supernatural boogeyman. Angela, particularly in Sleepaway Camp 3, is this human monster, a completely unhinged one, operating on these twisted principles, which offers a different kind of dark humor. Um, and just the film contributes to that broader legacy, of 80s slasher sequels, the period where franchises haven't exhausted that kind of initial premise, often devolved or evolved, depending on your view of it, just into this kind of increasingly silly, effects driven, self-aware, entries to the franchises. And Sleepaway Camp 3 is a prime example of just a series, confidently heading into that bizarre territory and finding an audience, um, that appreciates its specific, brand of madness. Um, so for fans, Sleepaway Camp 3 isn't just that third one or whatever. It's essential chapter in Angela's story. A high point for the franchise's dark comedy and just a genuinely fun, rewatchable piece of 80s slasher history. Um, it contributes significantly to why the Sleepaway Camp series maintains such a devoted cult following decades later. It reminds us that horror doesn't always have to be terrifying. Sometimes it can be ridiculously and hilariously deadly. Um, but I guess in conclusion, while Sleepaway Camp 3 Teenage Wasteland may never win over mainstream audiences or critics looking for high art, for a fan of the original, a lover of 80s schlock, and especially an admirer of the Angela Baker character. It's just Sleepaway Camp 3 is a bonkers, brilliant blast. It's flawed, sure, but its energy, the kills, Springsteen's performance, and its fearless dive, into dark comedy really making it an essential piece of that Sleepaway Camp puzzle and just a thoroughly enjoyable watch. It's exactly that chaotic, bloody, funny sequel that this fan wanted. And like I said, I love Sleepaway Camp 2, and the original, but I love this one just as much. Like, they're all different in their own ways, but they all feel equally special to me, and that's why I look at these films as some of my absolute favorite slasher films of all time. And I'm a huge slasher fan. It's my favorite subgenre when it comes to horror. So, and any other slasher fans out there know that there are tons and tons of slasher films out there, ones that I probably not even have time to watch them all. But when it comes down to, deep down to the top ones, my absolute uh, these are absolutely at the top. These are up there at the top of my list, up there with the Friday the 13th films, the Nightmare on Elm Street films, with the Halloween films, Texas Chainsaw films. My favorite slasher of all time, Popcorn. So I put these are definitely up there. When I'm mentioning all these top favorites of mine, and I thought it was such a great way to kick off this summer camp week by talking about these films and how special they are to me and just to everyone else in the horror community that love these films. And but I guess that's it. I guess that's it for today's show. So like I said, I just wanted to kick this off with the Sleepaway Camp films. And so I'll be returning this Sunday uh, with the rest of summer camp week. Well, I'll be talking about several more summer camp films. A couple of them will be horror films, and a few of them will not be horror films. So they range more in the comedy genre. Um, but I appreciate you guys for checking out this video. I really enjoyed doing this video, talking about these films that have meant so much to me for so many years. Again, I appreciate you guys for checking it out. I appreciate John for coming to the chat and talking a little bit with me today. And just everybody else, that's here to watch this live, or if you're here watching this on the replay, thank you guys for just taking the time to check out this video. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite is from the Sleepaway Camp films. What do you like about what drew you to those films? And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. Um, and you know, if you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button to just catch more videos from me like this one. Like I said, um, I will have more videos coming up here in the next little bit. Like I said, part 2 to summer camp week will be on this Sunday. And then, I have several other videos here from the 500 movies in 2025 series here on the channel you guys can check out. And just click that bell for any future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys, and have a good one. Stay cool.